This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Something I don't talk about very often on this channel is that I am actually a huge Star Wars fan. And today I'd like to show you how I quickly and easily painted up an entire Hoth-themed army for the miniatures game Star Wars Legion, including tons of snow basing, custom characters, and my full process for getting an army like this done in a reasonable amount of time with no airbrush required. Part 1. The figures. As the core of my Hoth-themed army, I bought the brand new Echo-based Defenders set. This set includes tons of Rebel troopers, E-Web gunners, some TaunTauns riders, and even one of those big laser turrets, along with Leia, Chewie, C-3PO, and R2-D2. But in addition to these units, I wanted to be able to field all of the popular lists for this battle force. So I bought an additional 2 laser turrets, as well as a generic Rebel officer from the Rebel Specialist set. However, I found that I was quite disappointed that the Leia provided in this set is in her Endor outfit and not her snow gear from Hoth. So I looked into some 3D printed options and ended up going with the skull-forged winter gear version instead. And while I was buying 3D prints, I figured, why not get 3D prints of Luke and Han in their Hoth gear as well? And because I couldn't choose between Luke in his Hoth gear and his flight suit, I decided, why not both? And paint up both so that I have more options for whatever narrative I want to play out with this Hoth army. So that is exactly what I did, and as a final bonus figure, I bought myself a tiny Wedge Antilles sculpted by Black Remnant to serve as a second or alternate Rebel officer figure so that I'd have lots of different options to play out whatever narrative I want with my games. If you're interested in any of these 3D printed figures, I provided links down in the description so you can get some for yourself. So for the main figures, assembly was pretty straightforward. I just used a knife to remove any mold lines and glued everything together with super glue. And for the 3D printed figures, the only real preparation needed was a bit of sanding, but because I didn't want to get resin dust all over my studio, I decided to try something new and wet sand the figures. Wet sanding is just like regular sanding, but you do it in a tub of water so that all the resin dust gets absorbed by the water and isn't put out into the air. And for my first try with this, I think it worked out pretty well. But I still wore a respirator for the whole sanding process because you really can't be too careful with resin dust getting into your lungs. After the resin figures were all dried off from their bath, I glued them to their bases and figure assembly was complete. However, just to add a little bit more complication to this whole process, I found that I had some miscellaneous Star Wars alien heads lying around from a previous project. These are 3D printed heads from Mel's Miniatures, and I ended up removing 2 of the 4 provided Celestins from the army and adding in a Duros, a Gran, a Mon Calamari, a Trandoshan, a Bothan, as well as just swapping around a few of the human heads for variety. Now obviously I wanted to give these figures their signature Hoth snow basing, and I will be doing that after they're all finished being painted. But I noticed that a lot of these figure bases are actually quite large, and I wanted to add a little bit more interest to the bases than just snow. So using episode 5 as reference, I decided to add in some rocky outcroppings as well as some miscellaneous cabling running across the ground. And for the rocky outcroppings, I used some of these little cork rocks and glued them down into piles of interest on the larger bases using PVA glue. For the cabling, I used a variety of different things. I had some string lights I was no longer using, so I clipped some parts of those wires and glued them down using super glue in places that looked good. I did the larger bases first as they had the most negative space that I felt needed to be filled up. And to mix up the wiring a bit on these larger bases, I actually experimented with a variety of other materials such as copper wire and even fabric hair ties. And once all of the glue was dried on these extra pieces on the bases, I wanted to blend them into the landscape, so I mixed up some basing paste in order to do this. Sometimes I'll use a pre-made basing paste, but in this case I wanted something rather specific, so I mixed up some of my own. And the basing paste I ended up going with was a mixture of this Army Painter grit type stuff from their basing kit they sent me, some PVA glue, some normal sand, even more PVA glue, and just a little bit of water. And I started out using this basing paste to just blend the rocks into a more believable sort of terrain, because I know I'm going to put snow on top of this, But at a certain point I realized, why not just cover all of the bases with this mixture, so that way any of the parts that are going to inevitably show through the snow will look consistent. So I added in a little bit of white paint to bulk up the basing mixture a little bit, and then added in some more of these small cork pieces just for fun, and then I applied a coat of this stuff to every single one of the bases. This took a lot of patience, but finally, after watching 6 Star Wars movies while assembling and putting all the bases on there, our figures were ready to be primed. For priming these models, I decided to go with just a plain white primer. As I discussed in one of my recent videos, there are a ton of ways to undercoat your models, but for this project in particular, I wanted the bright whites to be the focus of this army. Almost everyone is going to be wearing a white uniform, so I just went with a plain white primer for these models. And once all of the prep work was complete, it was time to get to the fun part, actually putting color on these models. For the base colors on these models, I decided to go with Army Painter Speed Paints, but you can feel free to use your own transparent paints of choice. As a side note, this video was filmed before I joined the paint development team over at Army Painter, so I only have access to the regular colors for this army. And to start out, I needed to first identify what colors to use on the basic troops. This sounds quite simple, as their uniform is made up almost entirely of whites, khakis, and grays. But what I found is this actually makes things much harder, as if it's not the right combination, the exact right white or the exact right gray, I found it doesn't quite look like a Hoth Rebel soldier. On top of this, the Hoth Rebel uniform is a bit inconsistent and looks quite different from shot to shot in the movie. With the lighting being different in every shot, it really changes the perceived color of the uniform. But anyway, after a ton of experimenting, I came up with 3 basic color mixtures, which will form the basis of our Rebel uniform. And these colors I'm going to refer to as Rebel White, Rebel Gray, and Rebel Khaki. The exact mixtures of these colors are on screen right now, as well as up on my website, where I've listed out all the colors I used in this army for you. And it was really quick and easy to do this using this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website and hosting platform that it makes it easy for anyone to make their own website, no coding or technical knowledge required. You just select a template that looks good to you, add whatever pages you want using either blank pages or even more of their wonderful templates, and then customize everything using their drag and drop system to build whatever kind of site you need for your hobby, business, or online store, all organized in a fun modular way that will resize itself on mobile devices. I really like that feature. I've been using my Squarespace site all year to house all of my reference documents, hobby progress, as well as my new online store full of merch, and I've been really happy with the results. So if you'd like to create your own website, why not check out squarespace.com today for a free trial. And when you're ready to take your website live, go to squarespace.com/DanaHowl for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. So with the main colors of our army figured out, I went as fast as I could, applying just a single coat of color to paint all of the standard troops in the army. Using reference from episode 5 to put all of the colors in the right places, but also taking a little bit of artistic license and varying up the colors a bit, as this is a rebellion, not an imperial army. For the skin tones on the troops, I used 4 main colors, placing them down on my palette and mixing them together in lots of different ways to get different skin tones. For the alien skin tones, I used these same colors, but blended in some magenta, blue, or green where necessary to get the results I wanted. And while I had these colors on my palette, I decided to paint Chewbacca because all the colors I needed were there, so why not? I used reference photos from a variety of his appearances and tried to color match as best I could, blending mostly hardened leather and dark wood together on the model to get a mottled, furry feeling. I finished him up with some Gravelord Gray for his bowcaster and bandolier, and used a mixture of magenta and dark wood to get the burgundy leather I wanted for his bag. And speaking of big furry guys, here is how I painted the TaunTauns. I started out with a coat of Crusader flesh for all of the exposed fleshy bits, and pallid bone for the horns. But for the fur, I actually varied it up quite a bit, blending together multiple colors of gray and white that I already had on my palette from painting the Rebel uniforms, as well as mixing in patches of holy white straight from the bottle and some runic gray for places where I wanted more of a bluish gray tone. In general, I tried to use cooler tones for the back of the TaunTauns and warmer tones for their soft underbellies, and everything got blended together with a soft, damp brush, so it all blends together nicely and seamlessly. I varied up the fur colors and patterns from TaunTaun to TaunTaun so that no two looked exactly alike, and between painting the TaunTauns and the core troops, I tried to give myself breaks from the monotony of painting all these core troops to paint some of the characters in the army. And I pretty much followed the exact same basic method that I used on the core troops. And once again, to keep this video from being an hour long, I'm not going to go into extreme detail on how I painted each and every character and hero in this army, as almost every single one of them I just used a single coat of color in the place where the color should go, really just a paint by numbers sort of thing. But a few of the characters do require a little bit more explanation than just put color where it's supposed to be, so let's get into that right now. For R2-D2, I wanted a little bit more of a cool white than I'd previously used on any of the troops, so I mixed up a roughly equal mix of runic gray and holy white to get a really nice cool white color. I applied this to the entire model and then set it aside to dry while I painted Luke's standard Hoth outfit, using reference images from the internet to get it as close to accurate as I could without straining myself too much. I was pretty much able to use my existing 3 Rebel uniform colors to get this effect, and for his various brown leather straps and things, I used dark wood. For his goggles, I used malignant green, and once again, for the metallic parts, as usual, I used Gravelord Gray. For Luke's lightsaber, I thinned down some magic blue quite a bit with some medium and water until it was a nice thin glaze. And I then added just a tiny amount of yellow to this mix. And when I say tiny, I mean not even a single drop, just a tiny little brush full. And I did this so that the blue would be brought into a slightly more cyan range without it looking green. I applied this color to the entire saber, as well as a little bit of his glove where I thought some light might spill over. And I then used a clean, damp brush to remove some of the paint in the center of the saber on both sides to create the illusion of a glow. At the same time, I removed most of the color from the glove, just leaving a little bit on there to create the illusion of a light source. And I did this same thing on one side of the pants, where I thought some of the lightsaber light might get reflected. For Flight Suit Luke, I did the exact same thing, but just used the flight suit colors first and then did the lightsaber effect. And at this point, I went back to R2 and painted in some of his blue details using High Lord blue, trying my best to stay inside of the lines, but inevitably I had to clean a lot of things up afterwards using a plain white acrylic paint, not a transparent one, just a plain acrylic white paint. As usual, I painted any black or silver details on R2 with Gravelord Gray, and I used this color to also do a little bit of panel lining as well, letting the color seep in between the panels of his body, I guess, to help each panel stand out, and finishing up with even more cleanup and highlights using that plain white acrylic paint. One of the things I think really helps make this army look unique is the snow basing. I find it really helps draw your eye away from some of the rougher, quickly painted parts of the army and helps add a lot of visual interest. And while the final look is quite complicated, in practice each step of making the snow happen is pretty easy. So to start out, I started thinking about what's underneath the snow. As when applying fake snow to bases, there's always going to be some places where the snow doesn't have full coverage. And so we want to think about what color we want the viewer to see through these cracks. I chose to use a dark blue glaze for this, as blue makes an excellent shadow color for snow and keeps things feeling nice and cold. So I mixed up a mixture of Magic Blue, Gravelord Gray, as well as some medium and water to thin it down and help it flow better. And I applied this to every one of the bases and let it fully dry before applying any fake snow. For the fake snow, I used a mixture of about 50% fake snow product and about 50% PVA glue with a tiny bit of water mixed in to add a bit of lightness and fluffiness to the snow. I found there's no real hard and fast mixture for fake snow, but you can just mix it together and then adjust it to your liking. So for instance, if you want your snow to be a little bit more gritty, you add more of the fake snow product. If you find your snow isn't sticking together enough, add more PVA glue. And if your snow is too thick, you can add just a little bit of water to make it a bit more fluffy. I applied this snow mixture to all of the bases using an X-Acto blade in most cases, just because that's what I had lying around, and leaving room in places where I wanted wiring or rocks to show through. Once the snow was fully dry, I added a glaze of thinned down Magic Blue to apply some shading to the snow and really give that bright blue sky reflecting off a snowy battlefield kind of look. I finished up each unit by rimming its base in a matte black, and for now, I think we can call this army battlefield ready. Of course, like any army, we could add countless highlights and details to this army, and while that is extremely tempting to do, for large armies like this, I try to remind myself of its function, which is to be played with. And for 2023, I want to think of these large army projects that I do less as an art project and more as an actual set of game pieces. So to actually motivate myself to play this game, because it's a great game, I really would love to play Star Wars Legion, I've decided to allow myself another 10 hours of adding painted highlights and details to the army after each completed game session. I think this could be a really interesting way to paint armies. I alluded to this method a little bit in my How to Paint Board Games video, but let me know what you think of this concept. Do you like to have all of your armies completely painted before you play with them? Or do you like the idea of sort of painting an army as it grows and as you play with it on the battlefield? In addition to that, let me know if you have any other questions about the methods that I used for painting this army. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Just leave them down in the comments section. And that's about it. Thank you so much for watching. I've been wanting to make a Star Wars Legion video for a long time now, and please let me know if you'd like to see more Star Wars Legion content from me in the future. Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Thank you to all of our lovely, generous patrons for supporting the channel this year. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in 2023. I think this will be the last video of the year. Hope so. Okay, bye.